Hello everybody. For today's HBL, we're going to continue the lesson on the Korean War. And during the last lesson, we actually explored this so-called question: who should be blamed for starting the Korean War? And in the last lesson, we concluded that to quite a large extent that North Korea, Kim, should be largely responsible. Although Stalin, Mao, of course, USA might have some responsibility, but the person that really initiated the war, the person that started the aggression, was Kim. And to just give some brief context, we also talk about this border clashes. So the border clashes were actually initiated by the South. They wanted to capture certain territories in the north. For example, in July 1949, the South Korean warships attacked North Korea military installations in the mouth of the Taedong River and sank most of North Korea's West Coast fleet. And of course, this provoked a retaliation from North Korea. And if you look at this map over here, this is the river. Okay, so the clashes actually occurred somewhere over here. And of course, these clashes were significant because these clashes were later on used by Kim to justify his invasion of South Korea. So now, because of the border clashes, it actually showed that the South was quite incapable of defeating the North, and that also gave Kim some confidence that they could defeat South Korea. And during that period of time or there were a lot of Koreans that deserted from South to North Korea, which demonstrated Ri's unpopularity. And so by mid-1950, and after getting approval from Stalin and getting some support from Mao, Kim decided to invade South Korea and was expecting a quick victory. So when you look at the border conflicts, Kim actually interpreted the ongoing border conflicts as justification to reunify Korea through force. And so we learned, of course, the last lesson, 25th June 1950, North Korea launched a massive coordinated assault across the 38th parallel, and North Korea framed it as a counter attack to southern incursions, okay, the border so-called conflicts, right? Now, if you turn to page 18 of your notes, we're going to look briefly at some key events that came after the invasion, all right? Now, this map over here shows the Korean War, in a simplified form in four maps. So on the extreme, this part on the extreme, my left, okay, June 25th, 1950, of course, North Korea invades South Korea. And basically, they crossed the 38th parallel and they managed to push the South Koreans all the way to this area and zone over here, which is a very small area. So clearly, the South Koreans were badly defeated. But then what happened was that on 1st October, the UN forces joined the war, helping the South Koreans, and they crossed the 38th parallel. And there's also, later on you'll learn, there's also the Incheon landings whereby the Americans actually landed over here. And this surprised so-called the North Koreans. And within 3 weeks, basically, the UN forces, which was largely made up of American forces, basically captured Pyongyang, the North Korean capital, and of course pushed so-called the North Koreans back all the way to near the Yalu River, which is near the border of China. And as the Americans pushed near to the border of China, then later on the Chinese would fight and join the war, and then basically would push the UN forces back. And of course, by July 27, 1953, basically it returned back almost to the original so-called position before the war even started. All right, so this is a brief overview and summary of what happened during the Korean War. So as mentioned, 19 October, Chinese volunteers crossed the Yalu River to join the North Koreans to push back the UN forces. January 1953, quite a significant time in US politics. Eisenhower replaces Truman, becomes the US president. And his campaign basically was one of pushing for, US, eventual withdrawal from Korea. And of course, he won the elections because of that so-called campaign promise. 1953, on March, Stalin dies, so quite a significant event as well, because with his death, there was a power struggle, but within the power struggle, Korea was never ever seen as a critical campaign. And so the Soviets, in some sense, also lost interest in maintaining and in supporting Kim to fight the war. And so by July 1953, the armistice in Korea was signed. The UN, North Korea, and Chinese forces signed a ceasefire and agreed to the division of Korea near its pre-war borders. And only South Korea refused to sign, but the South Koreans had no choice, even if they refused to sign, because they clearly had no military forces to do anything about it. So the armistice was signed. Now let's look at the impact and significance of this invasion of South Korea by North Korea, all right? And we're going to look at 6 ideas in this lesson. Now, the first impact, and if you turn to page 21, basically was how the US and UN responded to the invasion. And of course, US immediately referred the invasion to the UN for action. And the US government reasoned that major aggression had to be countered, or the lack of US response would invite further invasions by Soviet puppet states elsewhere in the world. So US really wanted a firm and military response. So UN agreed to take action against the invading North Korean forces, and basically they brought the so-called resolution to the Security Council. At that point in time, the USSR had been boycotting the UN because the UN had refused to recognize PRC. And so the resolution passed 9-0, and the UN agreed to send forces. And of course, with USSR boycotting the Security Council, they were unable to veto the resolution. Now, the US appointed General Douglas MacArthur to head the UN command, head the UN forces. 15 countries agreed to send troops to defend South Korea, but majority of the troops came from America. And US troops stationed in Japan were dispatched to Korea. Now, in the meantime, the US also sent their US Navy 7th Fleet to patrol the Taiwan Strait. So you can see over here, Taiwan Straits really is to prevent the GMD in Taiwan from being attacked by Mao's China. Okay, and the US now was, of course, determined to prevent the PRC from capturing Taiwan. If China, if PRC had captured Taiwan, then from here, basically, they could threaten US so-called bases in Japan and Philippines. And so Taiwan had to be protected. Now, the US forces, which is led by MacArthur, basically then launched an amphibious attack. Okay, so basically, at the port of Incheon. So over here, they launched an amphibious attack. You can see basically the landings, the ship landings. Okay, and then from here, all their so-called military equipment, even military weapons, transportation, and came in. And the North Koreans were very surprised by this tactic, because you're basically, sometimes cutting the North Koreans from the rear. And so the North Korean forces had to pull back, all right? And of course, they then pull back past the 38 parallel. Here's some pictures. Marine using flamethrowers, 951. They used it in World War II. Again, they used it during the Korean War to destroy the enemy. And by 1st October, UN forces crossed the 38 parallel, thanks to the Incheon's landing, all right? 3 weeks later, Pyongyang, the North Korean capital, fell, and the US-led UN forces continued to advance to Korea's border and of course advanced all the way to near China's border near the Yalu River. And basically, this was, of course, a very dangerous moment now for China because now the UN forces are very close to their border. Now, then what happens then? All right, if you turn to page 21, of course, then China comes in the picture. So in October 1950, Kim wrote to Stalin begging for military assistance to prevent the UN forces from crossing the 38th parallel, but Stalin was not willing to confront the USA, and so, of course, Stalin wanted China to assist. But the CCP were reluctant to engage the American forces. But in the end, because the American forces were so close to their borders and it threatened their sovereignty, in the end, Mao agreed later on to assist the North Koreans. And so on October 1950, 300,000 soldiers were mobilized. They called themselves Volunteer Army Corps, but actually, really, it's the army. And their surprise attack was effective, and the UN forces were driven south out of DPRK territory and back to the south. All right. Here you can see a poster by the Chinese, and it really shows, how the Chinese were really like defeating the Americans. Now, the UN forces had technological superiority. In other words, basically they had nuclear weapons if they wanted to use it. But the North Koreans and now the Chinese had numerical superiority. And MacArthur actually went so far as to suggest, let's nuke the Chinese. Something that, Luke might say, basically. But Truman was against this because Truman was fearful that this would cause or worsen the situation. So MacArthur made the argument that, the best time now is to strike mainland China, and the best course of action is to nuke them. But Truman reluctant to use nuclear weapon because the fear was that if I nuke China, then it might provoke USSR. And remember, USSR now had nuclear weapons. And maybe the USSR might use nuclear weapons in Europe or I don't know where. So there was a fear that it might escalate into something bad. And so Truman had to relieve MacArthur and replace him with General Matthew Ridgway. Now let's turn to page 22 of the notes. Now, what's the impact on China? Now, because of the Korean War, the communist regime in PRC was strengthened. And the reason is because Mao actually used the Korean War as a platform to rouse enthusiasm and to really mobilize public opinion by getting them to hate the Americans, right? So, when you have a common enemy, it really unites the people together. So in China, there was a national campaign, and one of the campaign was to suppress reactionaries or reactionary activities, basically so to weed out the GMD enemies within China. And so it was unleashed across PRC to remove any opponents of the government. So the Korean War actually helped China to find a reason to get rid of their enemies, to purge their enemies from within. During that period as well, land was redistributed to the peasants and the landlord class was eliminated. And basically, because of the PRC's victories in Korea, they were promoted, and in some sense, it was promoted as removing over a century of humiliating defeats at the hands of Europeans and Japanese armies. In other words, Mao's army had stood up against the Americans. In the past, China always were defeated by the West, but now China can defeat a strong enemy. And China gained reputation from many smaller states in the third world, by defending a small nation, which is in this case North Korea, against a superpower, which in this case the USA. Now, for China, its military involvement boosted its confidence because now, in some sense, it has stood up against a country that had nuclear power. And China even claimed that US was nothing more than a paper tiger, right? Now, some social impact. So you can see China losing soldiers. It's quite hard to estimate how much they lost, but China obviously, their sheer size, they could defeat the Americans, but of course it came at a cost. Clearly, from a political point of view, Sino-US relations worsened. Okay, there was hostilities between US and China because of the Korean War, not resolved until the 1970s. And US, of course, isolated China diplomatically for years, made a pledge to defend Taiwan, and US did not recognize Mao's government as an official Chinese state until later in 1971, which we'll discuss later on why that occurred. But basically, at least for the next 20 over years, there were hostilities. For Korea, of course, social impact are costly. South Koreans, nearly 400,000 died, nearly 500,000 in North Korea. And because of the Korean War, millions of Koreans were homeless, destruction of infrastructure, industry destroyed, families split up, displaced. It was really bad for the Koreans. Now, of course, one of the impact was that there were peace talks that started even as early as 1951, but the war dragged on for another 2 years, and the armistice was not signed until 1953, when Stalin died and Eisenhower had succeeded Truman. And because of the Korean War, of course, Korea remains divided. The 3-year conflict really ended with both sides declaring victory. South Korea had been saved from the communists, while North Korea had been rescued from the forces of Western imperialism. At least that's how the propaganda was being spread. Now, from a political impact point of view, of course, Korea now, even till today, remains divided. Kim will impose a Soviet-style system in North Korea, and of course, we clearly know his successors will then take over. In the South, Syngman Rhee actually established a right-wing dictatorship, but later on, of course, as time passed, South Korea would transit into a democratic state. And both states remain intensely suspicious of each other, heavily armed, and there were constant ceasefire violations. Now, if you turn to page 23, what about relations between the Soviets and the Chinese? So basically, clearly, in the short term, the alliance was strengthened between the two because they were fighting in some sense together with North Korea. But it also sowed seeds of future resentment of USSR by PRC. Now, throughout the war, Mao consulted with Stalin on all the key decisions, quite dependent on USSR for a lot of the military supplies. But Mao also resented Stalin. And because what happened was that because of the war, Stalin actually demanded cheap raw materials in return for signing the Sino-Soviet Pact, and also made China pay excessively for military supplies during the Korean War. And of course, this kind of like angered Mao because Mao's, was sending the troops, Stalin was just, providing weapons. But yet at the same time, Stalin was asking China to pay for all these military supplies. So there was kind of a resentment that Mao had towards Stalin. But at the same time, because China now had been that force to defeat the Americans, the war also increased Mao's feeling of moral superiority towards the Soviets. And slowly Mao began to see himself and see China as possibly that country that would lead the communist world revolution. All right. Before that, the Soviets were the leaders of the communist revolution, but now Mao begins to see himself possibly as that leader, okay, to give leadership to the communist so-called countries all around the world. Now, what about Japan? Well, clearly, because of the Korean War, it accelerated American attempts to support the economic reconstruction of Japan. And Japan's economy actually boomed during that period of time because they were now producing a lot of materials to support the Americans in the Korean War. And so Japan became an important convenient source of military supplies for the forces in Korea. And so the defense industry grew and it boosted Japan's economic recovery. And after the war, Japan remained a key part of American containment policy in the Asia Pacific and enjoy economic and military ties with the USA. Now, what about the social impact for USA? Of course, US troops died, not as high as the Chinese or the Koreans, but still substantial nevertheless. And the war deeply impacted public opinion in the US. And of course, basically for Senator Joseph McCarthy, during the period of the Korean War, he started his witch hunts for communists during this period. And McCarthy even attacked Washington for being too soft on communism. Now, because of the war, later on, the Democrats actually lost the next election, and a Republican became the president. And this is quite important because after some 20 years, the Republicans come back into power because they promised somehow to end the war and to solve this Korean War. And Eisenhower became president, and this is his Secretary of State, John Dawes. Now, for Eisenhower and Dawes, they would later on reject containment as a policy. And they also reject the idea of fighting limited wars. And later on, they will introduce this policy of possible massive retaliation and the use of nuclear arms and rollback. In other words, the policy of liberating communist-controlled areas. So, in other words, we need to go hard on the communists. And the US at least begin to see the communist world as one united entity. For the Korean War, it seems as if Stalin was directing it, Mao is supporting it, and so on. So it seems like they're united. But actually, after we open the archives, they are not as united as the Americans thought they were. In fact, they were quite divided and there were differences in opinion. Now, because of the Korean War also, now the US later on will come out with this so-called theory known as the domino theory. And the fear is that if we lose one country to communism, others would be lost too. So China was lost in 1949. And of course, Korea, 1950, being attacked. And therefore, the idea was that America needs to intervene. And later on, America was intervening in countries like, for example, Vietnam to prevent the Vietnamese from becoming communists. So this is fear that basically, if we lose one country to communism, the rest will follow. And so America will start to interfere in many countries. And so basically it encouraged development of this global alliance system with the US trying to coordinate efforts to counter this communist threat, all right? And so Truman starts to accept, remember, the National Security Council 68 proposal, and there was a massive rearmament program. The US military budget tripled and US expenditure rose tremendously. Again, all this a result of the Korean War. Now, with Japan, US began to strengthen its alliance with Japan. So a peace treaty was signed. Japan became a key so-called country in US system of alliance in Asia. Japan later signed a mutual security arrangement with the US, guaranteeing that US military bases could remain. And with the Yoshida letter, Japan even agreed to boycott against communist China. So basically now US is getting an ally, and the ally now is Japan. And even to this day, basically US military bases still remain in Japan. And of course, some of the Japanese are quite upset. And as you can see in this so-called news article in 2016, protesters gathered for anti-US military rally in Okinawa, right? So even though the Americans are allied with Japan, there are some Japanese that resent this so-called military alliance. This one in particular, what happened was that the protesters are very angry because a former US Marine employed as a civilian worker was arrested over the rape and murder of a local 20-year-old woman. Okay, so of course, this has been a problem, when there are so-called occupational forces in Japan. Now, because of the Korean War, US obviously decides to increase its military presence. Started to station US troops permanently in Western Europe, rearm West Germany, and in 52 plans were drawn up to increase the number of NATO divisions from 14 to 50 and turn NATO into a much stronger military alliance. And NATO membership expanded to include Greece, Turkey in 51, and later on West Germany in 1955. So, of course, when West Germany became a full member of NATO. That, of course, then led to the USSR subsequently forming the Warsaw Pact, so its own so-called alliance. Now, but besides the alliance in Europe, the US also decided that, okay, we need to build a global alliance to contain communism. And so in 1954, it formed SEATO, the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, US, France, Britain, Australia, New Zealand, Philippines, Thailand, Pakistan, in an attempt to fight communism in Asia. And of course, they will host military exercises, build economic foundations, improve living standards in Southeast Asian states. Of course, this organization no longer exists anymore by 1977. In 1955, they also promoted this organization within the Middle East area because the fear was that, we need to protect the Middle East from a Soviet attack. So CENTO was formed, okay, and created. But of course, CENTO also now no longer exists, and it ceased as an organization by 1979. Now, after the Korean War, basically the idea was US was committed to global military strategy and to oppose communist aggression and defending the free world. And it remained the cornerstone of US Cold War policy for the next 2 years. And you can see in this photo, it's quite an interesting photo because you can see Truman is grabbing the hand of the United Nations. And the United Nations is holding a gun. And David Lowe have this caption there, history doesn't repeat itself. In other words, we're not going to repeat the same mistakes we made in World War II, where we appeased the aggressors. If ever there's going to be an aggressor, we need to meet the aggression with force. Okay, and that's why the Korean War, in some sense, caused the Americans to realize that they need to defend the free world, and if so be it, defend the free world with military force. And with that, the US will start to support other countries that might potentially fall into communist hands. And so US being to support France in Vietnam, not total support, but still support. But later on, when the French withdrew from the war in 1954, America was by then bearing 70% of the cost of the French First Indochina War. And later on, America would get themselves heavily involved in the Vietnam War, for the Second Indochina-Vietnam War. Now, for Eisenhower, he also developed what we call a new look. And his policy focused on the use of nuclear weapons to meet its Cold War obligations without putting a strain on the US economy. And so what the new look entails really was that hopefully we can decrease expenditure for the Army and Navy, but we will increase expenditure for Air Force and nuclear weapons. And that will be our new look. That will be our strategy to combat communism in the future. All right. Now, what are some concluding thoughts as we think about the Korean War? And we can turn to page 25 of the notes. Well, the Korean War really brought the Cold War to Asia because countries like China, Japan, Taiwan all now become involved in this war. And the Cold War conflict starts to expand, right? And John Gaddis contends that Americans' real commitment to contain communism everywhere all originated in the events surrounding the Korean War. Why? Because the Chinese Civil War, America really pulled out. They in fact, essentially they gave up on the Kuomintang. But for Korea, the Americans actually put in the effort to ensure that communism did not win in Korea, and therefore South Korea was preserved. And from then onwards, Gaddis argues that, from there, you can see America trying to commit really to contain communism, and later on even possibly roll back, okay, and push back communism. Warren Cohen calls the Korean War a war that will alter the nature of Soviet-American confrontation, change it from a systemic political competition into an ideological-driven, militarized contest that threatened the very survival of the globe. In other words, because of the Korean War, you see more military engagement taking place. Sure, the superpowers will not fight each other directly, but there will be more military confrontations all around the globe, okay, and for America, in the name of fighting communism, promoting democracy and freedom. And so we have come to the end of this lesson. We have looked at 6 ideas, 6 impact on the invasion of South Korea by North Korea. And as we conclude in this lesson, just some things to take note of. When you think of short-term impact, basically we're looking at 1 to 10 years. Long-term impact, more than 10 years. But when we say that an event is significant, has significant impact, that means that event has deep consequences for many people over a long period of time. And even till today, right, it would shed light on enduring or emerging issues in history or in contemporary life. And the Korean War, the impact is an example. Till today, because of the Korean War, okay, we see all the political so-called impact we see in Korea. And it all stems from the impact of the North invading South Korea, right, in 1950. So this comes to the end of the lesson, okay? Please complete the MCQ questions that are in the Microsoft Forms, and I'll see you back at the lesson either on Thursday or Friday. All right, take care, everyone. Bye.